Hello, and welcome to Lesson 4. This lesson's titled Synthesizing Ideas, and synthesis will be a big part of it. The main purpose, though, is to go over your upcoming writing assignment, the first major writing project, which is a synthesis and argument essay would be the easiest way to describe it. I think the official title is Critical Text Analysis, Synthesis, and Argument. But there'll be two main sections to it, a synthesis section and an argument section. And the synthesis section is probably the one with which you're less familiar, so that's why the main focus of this lesson is synthesis. We're going to start by doing kind of an overview of the prompt for the paper, and then we'll transition to the reading from the textbook on guiding your reader, which is about structuring your paper. I think the first time we do an essay as a class, it's important to have a section on structuring the paper. And the whole point of structuring a paper, the reason why we give a paper a specific structure, the purpose of that is to guide a reader. And so that's one thing I like. I really like this section of the textbook, but one thing I like about it is that it's called Guiding Your Reader. And so we'll spend some time talking about that. And I have several sample student papers from students who have written this very paper that you're about to write in my classes in the past and have done a really good job. And those sample papers are actually required reading for next week. But today I'm going to use one of those papers, pulling some examples from it to illustrate what I mean about guiding your reader. That'll be the example for today. So those will be little snippets. I'd recommend reading those papers this week before you turn in your rough draft, so that you see some examples, and then it'll just be kind of review next week. The idea for next week is that it's very light reading because your final draft is due. So suffice it to say, it would help you to read the sample papers this week, though it's not required. So that'll be the second part of the lecture, is guiding your reader with examples from the student sample. And the third and final section will be where we really cover synthesis. We'll cover the synthesis section of the textbook, and just like with the guiding your reader section, we'll look at some specific examples from one of the student essays. So that's what we're doing today. Like I said, for this first part, we're going to go over the actual writing assignment itself. It's kind of a brief introduction before we get to those specifics about structure and synthesis. As I said, it's a critical text analysis, synthesis, and argument. We're going to talk about what exactly these terms, analysis, synthesis, argument, what they mean on the next slide. Right here I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the paper. This language I'm about to put on the screen is pulled directly for the prompt for the writing assignment from those instructions that are on Canvas. So I'm not going to go over every detail of them. There's a lot of really basic information on there, like word count, MLA format, that kind of thing. Right now I'm looking at just in terms of content, what are you supposed to do, what are you supposed to write in the actual essay. So there's a bulleted list on the prompt that lists out kind of the 4 parts of the essay. An introduction, that should be fairly straightforward, although we'll talk in a little bit more detail about introductions later on when we talk about guiding your reader. The key to an introduction is to not open with something too specific. Open with something general enough that you hook the reader. What is, in terms of the point of your paper, what is it about that's widely appealing, that would reach a wide audience? Start with that. And by the end of the intro, you transition from the general to the more specific. So by the end of the intro, you have your thesis statement. And that's the key thing, to always end your intro with a thesis. Now, something you might be wondering at this point is, well, how do I write a thesis for an essay that's both a synthesis and an argument? We're going to get to that. We have a whole section of the lecture devoted to writing thesis statements for this particular paper, so we'll get to that soon. Next is the synthesis section. There's a term you'll hear a lot in college called a literature review. In the synthesis section of this paper is really a literature review. A literature review is where you review all of the literature on a specific topic. For instance, if you're writing about global warming, you would review what scholars have said about global warming and give kind of an overview of that to your reader. You review the literature on the topic. But a literature review is supposed to be succinct and present a lot of information in a very short space. All of the research, in a very short space. Most literature reviews, even in long academic articles, are just a few pages. And so synthesis, you should have some knowledge of synthesis from the last lecture, even though we're really going to discuss it in detail today. Synthesis becomes the main skill for writing a literature review, because synthesis is the method one uses to convey a lot of information about different articles or different topics in a short space. So it's technically called a literature review, and I want to give you that term now so that when you take other classes you'll recognize it and be like, oh, I wrote a literature review in English 101. Okay. But synthesis is really what you're doing there. And then there's the argument section. You're probably more familiar with the skills of argument. We're still going to talk about it. But basically, in the synthesis section or the literature review, you're giving an overview of what other people have said on the subject. In the argument section, you're giving your argument, your opinion of what you believe about the subject. And that's, excuse me, that's the difference. Finally, we have the conclusion. This should be the most familiar part to you from things you've written in the past. It can be very short. That's one thing I would say is you don't need to have a long conclusion necessarily. Short, to the point, kind of restate your argument, maybe tie together the different threads, say why your argument is important. That's it. You don't need to recap every single part of the paper. That's key. A lot of times you see these long conclusions because students are going back over everything they already said. You don't need to repeat everything. You just need to kind of restate the main argument so that's clear in your reader's mind before they finish. And if you have a few different ideas you've introduced, maybe kind of tie those together a little bit if you haven't done so already. And you have an opportunity in the conclusion for what I call the so what factor, which is where you show what you're writing about, why it's important, why it matters. And that's really the point of the conclusion, is to end on that note. Really drive home, not introduce anything new, but explain, why a reader who should care, why they should care about this subject. They may not be super familiar with whatever you're writing about, but there's a reason why you've written this paper. Make that connection to the audience. Connect with them. You think it's important. Why should they think it's important? Show that in the conclusion, but keep it brief. Just a few sentences for the conclusion. Okay, so now to kind of explain those different parts of the paper, specifically, the title, analysis, synthesis, argument, and the difference between synthesis and argument, we're going to talk about the levels of critical thinking, which is what you could call my purpose or rationale, the reasoning behind giving you this assignment. These are skills, analysis, synthesis, and argument, that you will use well beyond the classroom, beyond this classroom. You'll use it in other classrooms in college, but you'll use these skills also in the profession. They help you in a lot of ways because they're basically ways to interpret information. And wherever you go, whatever you do, you're going to be confronted with information and asked to interpret that information. Or seeing that it's for your own benefit to interpret that information. So these are the skills you use to interpret information, and I'm going to real quickly go through them in order. They become more challenging and more complex as you go. So we're going to start with summary, which you're probably all familiar with as a concept. It's kind of the most basic level of looking at a text or looking at information, and then the skills will become more complex, harder to master as we go. And I'm hoping that even though it's the first major paper, you'll be able to display all of these through the course of the paper by building on what you've done so far in the quarter. So summary is simply taking something, reiterating it in your own words, maybe making it shorter, simpler, more to the point, but being able to say what someone else has already said in your own words, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do. You have to show you've really understood what you've read. You've really understood the information in order to do summary. But you're not really adding, changing, comparing anything, so it's still the most basic of these 4 skills. The next is analysis. which is where you explain the significance of an idea. So beyond just summarizing it, why is this idea important? Why does it matter? That takes some deeper thinking and explanation on your part. And you'll see this most often when you receive feedback from professors on your essays, because you'll have a thesis, you'll have evidence to support that thesis, and then the analysis is where you explain how your evidence supports the thesis. So you explain the significance of your ideas and the evidence you've introduced. That's analysis. And so it's a major step beyond summary, but it's something hopefully you've done before and you've been doing throughout this class, as you've been doing the readings and the discussion board posts, and so it's kind of implicitly always involved in persuasive academic writing. Next is synthesis, and this is where we start to get more complex and into kind of the things you're doing in this paper that you might not have been asked to do before in other classes. So analysis takes the thinking to a deeper level, but you're still, with analysis, mainly looking at one text, one idea. So with synthesis, you're looking at the relationship between different ideas, and we talked about this in the last lecture, but a synthesis would be where you take 2 or 3 or more pieces of writing or text, and you compare them, you contrast them, you explain the relationships. So it's essentially analyzing more than one text at once and explaining the relationship between those texts to your readers. Finally is argument. And argument is the most challenging, complex one here, because this is where you offer something of your own. With the other 3, even with synthesis, you're still working with other people's ideas and work. With argument, that's where you're adding your perspective. You're doing your work. And so it's the most important, most challenging, most complex one. And the idea, the spirit of this assignment that we're about to go over in more detail is for you to have your own opinion, your own unique perspective after having read all this stuff. You've done the reading guide, you've looked at all these essays, you've read a lot of what people think about technology. What is your perspective? And more importantly, how does that perspective add something new to the conversation that these other writers haven't said yet? That's what makes argument the most important and most challenging thing. Just repeating what someone else has said, even if it's a clear position or stance, and even if it's in your own words, that's still not an argument. That's still, for all intents and purposes, summary. It's just summary of an argument. An argument is your own unique original idea. And so we're going to, like I said, explain how to do that through the course of the rest of this lecture. So this next section is about structuring your paper, as I said earlier. What it really does here, what we're going to do is go over the guiding the reader section of your textbook with specific examples from the sample student essay. And this slide is very telling, because this image, because when you write a paper and you give it a structure, you're giving your reader signposts. If you're driving down the road, you don't know where to go, you look at Google Maps or you look at the signs on the road that tell you how to get to wherever you're going. The structure of your paper tells the reader where you're going, what they're reading. And so different structures make more sense for different genres. And within a genre, there's certain moves the reader is looking for the writer to make. And if you don't make those moves, you'll lose your reader. Your paper won't make sense. And remember, like we've talked about before, audience is everything. So you really want to guide your reader, guide your audience, make it an easy journey, an easy experience for them. And so you need signposts throughout your paper. And signposts are sentences, paragraphs, paragraph breaks. It's really important where you start and end your paragraphs. That will help your reader follow your train of thought. So we're going to talk specifically, how do you do that? First up, obviously, is thesis statements. Before we talk specifically about thesis statements, I wanted to have this quote on here from the textbook. They open the chapter by saying, traffic lights, street signs, and lines on the road work like our paragraphs and sentences. Those things are meant to help guide people. Similarly, our paragraphs and sentences are meant to help guide the reader. So the textbook in this opening sentence of the chapter really dovetails with my own philosophy about paragraph breaks and structuring the paper, and so that's why I wanted to have this quote on here. But the thesis statement is probably the most, I should say, it is the most important signpost. And so your thesis will signal more to your readers than anything else. So we're going to go over how to write a good thesis right now. Thesis, as the textbook says, should be clear. It shouldn't be too dense or packed with big words. Sometimes I think students like to use big words to impress their professors, but that can really make a paper harder to read. So just say it in the most straightforward way possible. Just tell us what it is. It should also be specific, or the textbook uses the word narrow. You don't want a big thesis because it's hard to prove. If you argue that recycling will stop global warming, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe you can prove that. The whole books have been written on that subject. If you're writing a 4 or 5 page paper, you have to have a manageable thesis. You need a narrow, specific focus. If in a situation you were writing on global warming, this hypothetical example, you want to focus in on one specific aspect of that one specific issue, not take on all of global warming. And the subject for this essay is clearly technology's influence on society. I was just giving you an example. But that's a broad subject itself, technology's influence on society. So you'll want to pick a specific aspect of that. Talk more about that in a minute. Finally, it should be located at the end of the introductory paragraph. This is for the persuasive academic writing genre that we're doing in this class. In other genres, the thesis can be different places. So don't read this as the only way to do something, but the best way to do the type of writing you're being asked to do in this class. So I mentioned before, if a reader's reading a certain piece of writing, they know the genre, they have certain expectations based on that genre. For instance, persuasive academic writing is a genre. An expectation there is for it to be, the thesis to be at the end of the intro. The reason is, if you open with your thesis, it'll be too specific and you'll lose the reader. You need a little bit of general stuff to hook the reader, then you move to your thesis. The reason the thesis shouldn't be anywhere else besides the end of the intro is if your reader starts reading the paper and they don't know what the thesis is, they'll be completely confused. They won't know what the paper is about. They'll be lost. So to kind of use a comparison to illustrate my point, if you were, say, writing a novel in the murder mystery genre, you wouldn't want to reveal who the killer is at the beginning, because the point of a murder mystery genre is to keep your reader in suspense. You'd then have the thesis of a murder mystery at the end of the murder mystery. But you're not writing a murder mystery for this class. You're writing an academic essay. And in that genre, readers like to know what they're reading about before they get too far in the essay because of that genre. In the academic genre, people read lots of articles and they have to get through them quickly. So they want people to get to the point. They want to know why they're reading the rest of it. It shouldn't be a mystery. So those are some of kind of the basics about thesis statements. Before we go into the specific examples, I want to give you some more signposts. So thesis statement signals the argument of the paper. Topic sentences are what we'll talk about after thesis statements. They signal the argument of each individual paragraph. These are also often called supporting points. You have several points, several ideas that help support the main point or the thesis. And you want to mention those in the first sentence of a body paragraph so the reader knows what that paragraph is about. And we'll talk about those more after we talk about thesis statements. And then finally, transitions, which are what helps you connect one topic to another in those topic sentences, those body paragraphs, so that the paper flows well. And then paragraph breaks signal that the writer is moving from one topic to a new one. So, from one topic to another. So, if you put 3 major topics in one paragraph, you're going to really confuse your reader. I would ideally recommend only focusing on one topic per body paragraph. It just makes the paper so much easier to follow. A paragraph break signals you've talked about one thing, you're moving on to a new thing, all these things support your thesis. This means you're going to have to write analysis. You're going to have to write in depth to have paragraphs that aren't super short. So that's something we'll be working on learning as well. All right, so now kind of back to the thesis, more specifics about the thesis. This chapter, I really love this chapter. It really hits the fundamentals of writing. It really gets those perfectly. And so they have these steps to writing a great thesis. First is state your topic as a question. So another way to think of writing is think of writing as inquiry. By writing about a subject, you're going to learn more about it. And so it helps to start with a question. We often call this a research question. For this particular paper, you're not choosing a topic. I've given you the topic of technology. These are skills you're learning in this unit are probably, especially synthesis, some very new skills. So rather than having you pick a topic and work with these new skills on that topic, I'm giving you a topic here to kind of help you. And then later on, you can then apply those same skills with your own topic later in the quarter in other classes. Essentially what we'll write later in the quarter will be very similar, but there you'll be working with your own topic instead of here, you're working with a topic I've given you. But it still makes sense to start with inquiry, to start with a question. And so this paper is asking you to synthesize what you've read over this unit and then make your own unique argument about that subject. So your one question you might have is, well, what is my opinion on this subject of technology? And so I just gave one example. Does Google make people less smart or smarter? Because we've seen two of the articles we've looked at have made that argument both ways. With the is Google making us stupid, arguing that it hinders our creativity and thus less smart, and the smarter than you think, arguing that Google allows us to store more important things in our memory, thus making us smarter. So two sides of that coin. What's your stance? That might be a question, just one example of a question you could start with. So after starting with a question, two, turn your question into a position. So do some research, some reading. In this case, you're going to be asked to read at least 3 of the articles from this unit. So do some research, or do some reading, and then come up with an answer to the question. So in this case, just as the example, this is a very bare example. It'd be better to have a more specific one. I'm just giving an example to help with this project. You could answer the question hypothetically by saying, Google makes people smarter. Next is to narrow your position. So you ask a question, you answer the question, you come up with something more specific. Your first answer is probably going to be very broad and general, like mine. You wouldn't want to use your first answer in the actual paper. You'd want to have a more specific answer. So narrow your position. And I have an example of that here. By helping us find information that we used to have to keep stored in our heads, Google makes people smarter. That's essentially the thesis of the Smarter Than You Think article in my own words. But it's talking about memory, so it's narrowing the position to a specific focus. Finally, qualify your thesis. It's easy to make big, sweeping claims. If we say recycling will stop global warming, that is a position. It is an argument, but it's not a good thesis because it's not qualified. You can't actually prove that. Even if you wrote a whole book, you couldn't probably actually prove that just recycling would completely stop something as massive as global warming. So it helps to add qualifying words. Now, these are not words that concede your stance. You don't waver in your stance. They just kind of rephrase the argument to make it more manageable. So I say Google can make many people smarter. So I'm saying it has the potential to do this. That doesn't mean it always does this, but it does mean that it does do it. So I haven't wavered in my stance. I've just kind of managed it to indicate that maybe it doesn't happen every single time. And I also say many people smarter instead of just people smarter. That way, it's not every single person, it's just some people. So again, kind of, you don't have to do this every time. It depends on what your thesis is. But if your thesis is too sweeping, if it's too broad, too general, you can't really prove it in a paper. By qualifying it, you might be able to narrow the focus enough to make it provable in a paper. So these are the steps to writing a thesis. Start with a question, turn your question into a position, answer your question essentially. Once you have that position, you know your stance, narrow your focus so you can do it in one paper, and then qualify your thesis so that you have a very reasonable thesis to prove. Now we're going to look at an example from the student paper. So this is pulled directly from what a student wrote in this class for this assignment before. And this student says in their thesis, technology today is not only changing the way we think, it is advancing our society through means of being able to spread knowledge more productively. So let's break this down and see why it works as a thesis. Okay, it takes a clear position. Technology is advancing our society. Some people would disagree with that, including people you've read in this unit, so that's very clearly a position. It's an argument. It's not a fact. If you just say, technology is influential, that's a fact. No one can deny its influence, but this takes a stance on whether that influence is good or not. It's advancing our society. That's a positive thing. That makes it into a position or a stance rather than just a fact. It is narrow because the student says it's being able to spread knowledge more productively. So it's a specific way that technology is advancing the society. Could this thesis be even more specific? Probably. The student could mention a specific type of technology. That'd be a great way to do it. So you can always get more narrow, and the narrower the better, because the more narrow it is, the easier it is to prove in a short paper like the one you're writing. The paper may seem long to you, but in terms of proving an argument on that scale, it's very short. So the more narrow, the more specific your argument, the better. So this thesis could probably be more narrow, but it's narrow enough that it's a pretty solid, pretty good thesis for a paper like this. I'll mention real quickly, that thesis also wasn't really qualified. I think it's a manageable enough argument. The student didn't necessarily need to add any qualifiers, but that would be one thing the student could do to that thesis. Now we're going to move on to talk about topic sentences. So remember, the thesis is the argument of the whole paper you present at the end of the intro. Topic sentences are the little mini arguments you use to prove your thesis that you state at the start of each body paragraph. So it announces the argument of a paragraph, is what the textbook said. And I like that word announces because that's what you're doing. Just as the thesis should be at the end of the intro so the argument is clear before the reader reads the rest of the paper, similarly, the topic sentence, the supporting point, should be at the start of the body paragraph so the reader knows what that paragraph is about and how that paragraph relates to the thesis. So it announces the argument of the paragraph. If you have your topic at the end of the paragraph, the reader will be confused the whole time they're reading the paragraph. You don't want your reader to be confused. Like I said earlier, good paragraphs focus on a single point. If you try to put too many topics in one paragraph, it's going to make the paragraph very difficult to read. Usually the topic sentence begins the paragraph. The textbook says usually, because in other genres it might be different, but again, in the academic writing, the persuasive writing we're doing in this class, you want it at the start of the paragraph. And I would say that's true almost always when you're making an argument. Here's an example from the student essay. Think of our brain as a computer and how computers use their tools to improve themselves and increase production. So, this clearly tells the reader what the paragraph is about. It takes a stance. Our brains are like computers. Not everyone might agree with that, or at least that might be a new idea to some people. And then you're going to read through this paragraph and see how our brains are similar to comparisons. Now let's say, for the sake of illustrating this, let's say you started reading a paragraph in a paper. In that paragraph, we're comparing our brains to a computer. That would be really strange if you didn't have a topic sentence like this announcing that first. That would be very strange. So the reason I picked this example is I think it really illustrates a more kind of complex concept. Our brains are like computers. And if you don't know that's what you're reading about, that's going to be very off-putting. So it's a good topic sentence. It's an argument announced at the start of the paragraph, but it also shows how important it is to have that announcement at the start of the paragraph. So if you're reading a paragraph and, it starts with a sentence like, such and such person was born in 1985, that's not a argument, that's a fact. That doesn't tell the reader what that paragraph is about. It might be about this person who was born in 1985, but who is this person? Why do they matter? You need an argument at the start of your body paragraphs. Okay, finally our transitions. So you have the thesis, the argument of the whole paper. You have the topic sentences, the arguments of each paragraph that support the thesis. Transitions are the connections between those little arguments, between those paragraph topics. If you've got 3 or 4 things that support your thesis, what is their relationship? Why are they all on the same paper? That's where transitions come into play. So they help readers move from thought to thought, from sentence to sentence, from paragraph to paragraph. Is what the book says. It's true. I think we mainly think of transitions as from paragraph to paragraph, and in terms of the writing and editing we'll do in this class, that's what we'll be looking at most in terms of improving transitions. But the book makes an important point here that transitions should really be present throughout the entire paper. In other words, you have all these sentences in a paragraph. Those sentences should all be talking to each other, so to speak. The reader should see how you get from one sentence to the next. That should flow smoothly. So that's not as an obvious kind of a thing to do, but definitely something to look for as you read and revise your own papers. I have a strategy I learned from another professor called topical transitions, which, because you're probably reading this, you're like, okay, transitions are hard to do. How do I do this? Topical transitions is where you show the connection between the topic of the previous paragraph and the current one. So if you have one topic per paragraph, and every paragraph has its own topic, your paper will already be kind of easy to follow. But to really help is you go from one topic to the next, make a connection. Don't just say, next, because what is that word next? Why are we talking about this next? Why does it come after the previous thing? You want to show those connections, show that relationship as best you can. Okay, here's some examples from the student paper, the end of one paragraph, the start of the next. So, I thought if I used the same sentence as the topic sentence, it would be kind of an easy example. So here's the sentence from the end of the previous paragraph. Using these tools to help make our lives easier and faster allows us to be able to use our brains in more productive ways that could help build onto previous discoveries and knowledge. And then here, think of our brain as a computer and how computers use their tools to improve themselves and increase production. So, if you were just reading these 2 sentences on their own and you didn't know that one was the end of one paragraph and the other was the start of another paragraph, they would flow seamlessly. It sounds like the student's just expanding on their idea here, and that's the point. One paragraph is about how computers make our brains more productive. The student is summarizing the argument from Smarter Than You Think. And Smarter Than You Think doesn't go into so much how our brains work. It talks about how Google makes us smarter, according to that author. But in terms of our actual brain chemistry, how our brains work, that's not something the author of Smarter Than You Think really covers. So this student had a great idea. He thought, well, I'll explain that, and that'll help readers. And so you have one paragraph that's kind of the point, the topic, the purpose of that paragraph is reiterating the argument for Smarter Than You Think. The next paragraph, the point of that is showing how our brains work like computers. The connection between those things is that the second thing helps one understand the first thing better. And so there's a very clear connection, but the student could leave that connection to be implied. Here, he makes that connection overt. He states that connection for the readers. And that's important because you'll have thought through your paper and organized it, but because you've done that, a lot of these connections are in your own head, and you might not realize, you might not think to put them into the paper. That's human nature. We all do that. I do that. So it takes time, energy, and focus to say, How do I make this connection clear, not just to me, but to readers? Remember, write for readers, not yourself. So make that connection clear. The connection between the idea of one paragraph and the next, and do that for all your paragraphs. One strategy I have for this is to copy and paste the first and last sentence of each paragraph into a new document, and then read just that document. I've basically done that here with 2 paragraphs to illustrate this concept from the student example. So you can see here very clearly how we go from one paragraph to the next seamlessly. So if you copy them all, the first and last sentences, into another document and then read it, like how we read these 2, every time it flows like this one does, you're good to go. You don't need to make any changes. But if there's a part in that new document of just first and last sentences where the flow breaks down, where it doesn't make sense, then you're going to need to revise your transitions. You're going to need a topical transition. So that's a really helpful strategy for writing good transitions. Transitions are one of the hardest things to write. I still struggle with them. Students come to me all the time asking about transitions. So it's one thing I've learned over the years that helps. And next week when you do peer review of these rough drafts and you read someone else's paper as part of your assignment for the week, that's something I'll ask you to do in your peer review, is do this. Copy and paste your partner sentences into a new document and look for those breakdowns and flow. Make suggestions about transitions. So helpful information on transitions kind of rounds out that discussion. A thesis is the argument of the whole paper. A topic sense is the argument of a particular paragraph. The transitions connect all of your topic sentences together. Okay, here we're moving on to the literature review or the synthesis section. So that last section of the lecture was kind of general overview for the entire paper, and that those tips could be applied to any persuasive, argumentative academic paper. Here we're going to focus specifically on how to write synthesis because you probably, like I said, haven't done it too much before. So our textbook goes through several steps to synthesizing ideas, and these are also on the prompt for the writing assignment. First, let's just revisit what the definition of synthesis is. What I'm going to be looking for in your essays are synthesis statements. And as this quote I provided on the last lecture, I repeat here again, a synthesis statement is a succinct statement that brings into focus not the central idea of one text, but the relationship among different ideas in multiple texts. So, again, you're not looking at one idea and analyzing just one idea. You're looking at multiple ideas and explaining that relationship. So here are the 3 steps. Show the relationship between the ideas in 3 different articles. So for your paper, I've asked you to pick 3 articles from the critical reading unit. You'll have read at least 2 of them, but you'll have read at least 3 of them at this point. But those 3 are all kind of on different subjects. Games, search engines, and then one of your choice. So 2 of them could be on the same subject, but they might be on different ones. So you might want to revisit some of the others and try to pick the 3 that are the best fit for your paper. Not just the 3 you've read, but the 3 that are the best fit for your paper. So this might involve a little more reading, which is normal. When you write a paper, you have to do research. So reading is a normal part of the process of writing a paper. But also also what I'm trying to say is the reading for this week and next week is very light. It's about 10 pages this week and a couple sample papers next week you may have already read. So you've got time to read more of the articles is the idea. And the reason it's 3 articles rather than 2 is 2, it would be easy to just do an either or thing, to just look at 2 sides of an argument. But that's a bit of a fallacy. Topics like this are complex and multifaceted, and there's more than just 2 perspectives. So you don't want to end up in a binary either or thing where there's only 2 options. You want to have a broad enough survey of the subject, and I think at a minimum that's 3. And so we're working with 3. So in your synthesis section of your paper, to come back to this bullet point, you'll show the relationship between these three different ideas, or these three different articles. You will, by the time you write your final draft, you will have developed your own unique idea. And so you also want to show the connection, the relationship between this conversation these three articles are having and your own idea. You're essentially writing the fourth article, would be a way to put it. And so toward the end of your literature review, you'll want to also incorporate your own writing, your own argument into that conversation. A literature review is like going to a party and you hear several people having a conversation. Say they're talking about a new movie that came out. You kind of hear some of that conversation, then you jump in. You say, hey, that's a good point, but have you thought about this? That's what a literature review or a synthesis section does. So thus, the third and final thing is to show how your own idea is unique, to jump into, enter that conversation. This is the reason why we do research. A lot of people say they do research to back up their own argument, and that's true. But you don't want to just reiterate what the research says. You don't want to say, here's my idea, here's someone who says exactly the same thing, look, it's proof, because if someone says exactly the same thing, it's not really your idea, it's that other person's idea. Because if you're quoting it, they wrote it first. So the real purpose of research is not just to back up your idea, but to show how your idea is unique and add something new. So you use research to show to the reader this conversation that's already taking place, as well as how you fit into that conversation, but also add something new. It makes sense that you're talking with these people, but you're not just repeating what they're saying, you're adding something. So these are the 3 steps, and we're going to go through these again with examples from the student paper. And for help writing this, because I know this is probably hard, it's probably new. Again, that little book, They Say, I Say, has those templates where they'll have they say statements. And they say statements, remember, are basically synthesis statements. And so you can kind of plug in your own ideas into those templates, or at least use those templates as a starting point. Sometimes I have such a hard time writing. Sometimes I just stare at a blank screen for like an hour. And that feels like wasted time, obviously, but I don't know what to write. So sometimes seeing something else, starting with an example, can just get me going. I can come back and revise later and polish it up and make it sound nice, but to just be able to get going, to just get started writing is sometimes the hardest part for me. So is kind of an example to help with that. These templates from They Say, I Say, they'll give you something to start with. You go back, revise later, but you'll have that starting point. So I really encourage you to use those, especially if you're having trouble, especially if you're not sure how to write synthesis. So here are some examples. I wanted to start with the student's thesis again, because this is the difficult part of the paper. This is the part I would guess you're probably most confused about. If I'm doing a synthesis and an argument, what is my thesis? That's probably what you're wondering. How do I write a thesis and then go into a synthesis section where I synthesize all this other stuff before I even get to my own argument? Well, that's actually what happens most often in academic writing. Most academic articles you'll see start with their thesis, they review the literature, then they prove their argument. So how do you make that all flow smoothly? Well, your thesis can often address what others have said, but introduce your own unique argument. And the student from the example does that really well. They say, technology today is not only changing the way we think, it is advancing our society through means of being able to spread knowledge more productively. So you'll see the 2 parts here. The phrase, not only changing the way we think, shows how the student engages with the ideas from the articles. So that phrase, not only, is a synthesis type statement. He's saying writers out there have already addressed how technology changes the way we think. So there he's showing the synthesis. He's showing that conversation that already exists. But he adds his own opinion. Not only is it changing the way we think, it's also advancing our society through means of being able to spread knowledge more productively. So the student agrees with people like the author of Smarter Than You Think that technology is changing the way we think, but it's also making us more productive, which is related and is an important point too. So this is a thesis that shows how the student's engaging with the material already out there, but adding their own unique perspective, which is a lot to ask. It's very demanding. It's hard enough just to write a thesis. And so my advice, I'll reiterate this at the end of the lecture, is to not try to write this type of thesis on your first draft, and to also not turn your first draft into Canvas, even for the rough draft. I would write at least 2 drafts before you turn in your rough draft Canvas, because we often figure out what we're trying to say as we write. And so you might not have a thesis that both incorporates what others have said and gives your own unique opinion. You might just have one or the other when you first start out. But if you write your paper and you write an early draft sometime this week in the next few days, you can then take a day or 2 off from it, come back to it with fresh eyes, go back through it, and as you read it and work on revising it, then you might kind of figure out, oh, I have the synthesis here, the argument here, I can put these together in the intro. And then redo your thesis and then revise the paper accordingly. Then you'd have a really strong rough draft to turn into Canvas. You want a really strong rough draft to turn into Canvas so that you get good feedback from students. And you probably need to do at least a couple of drafts before turning it into Canvas to make sure you have a strong rough draft. So I would do that, and I would revise your thesis the second time through. You could even, this is a tip I'll bring up again later, you could even make the conclusion from your first draft the intro to your second draft. Just copy and paste it, because I said we often discover what we're trying to say as we write, and in this case you'll probably tie together the synthesis and the argument and the conclusion, because you'll have just written both and you'll be recapping them in your conclusion. And so this paper might even really lend itself to that. And you want to have both in your intro. If your thesis just has the synthesis, the reader will think it's just a synthesis essay and won't know about the argument that's coming. If you just have the argument, they won't know why you're doing the synthesis section first. So even though this paper has these 2 clear sections, you want to try to, if you can, cover both in your thesis like this student does here. It's a tough thing to do. That's why you should always do multiple drafts. So here are some examples from their topic sentences. I'm going to real quickly, because I know it's a long lecture. Next week's will be much shorter. I'm going to real quickly go through their starting sentences, because almost every sentence in this particular example, or every topic sentence in the synthesis section, is a synthesis statement. A synthesis statement is a statement that ties together 2 or more pieces of writing. So if you're just talking about one piece of writing, not a synthesis statement. 2 or more is a synthesis statement. And the student in the synthesis section of their paper had a statement that talked about 2 or more articles in almost every paragraph. So we'll go through these quickly. The first sentence in the second the very second paragraph of the paper, so right after that thesis we just looked at, the student says, in the article, "Is Google Making Us Stupid" by Nicholas Carr, the thesis is quite different. And he explains why. But he's saying right there, how you might say, how is he talking about 2 pieces of writing? That's just one. It's just Carr. It's just "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" No, it's 2 pieces of writing. It's "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" and it's his own piece of writing, his own essay. This is the first sentence after the thesis. We just looked at the thesis. This is the first sentence in the second paragraph. So this student is saying the author of "Is Google Making Us Stupid" takes a very different stance from his own. And that's okay. You can look at articles, pick articles that disagree with you. As long as it's on the same subject, it'll fit in the paper. This makes sense because the student's talking about how technology is making us smarter, and Carr argues that it doesn't. So he's looking at both sides. So this is a great transition from the intro, and it ties together the student's writing with the research, which is exactly the point of synthesis. Here's this next one. Critic and journalist Sam Anderson has the same outlook as Carr. So he's moved on to a paragraph on the second article, and he's saying this person has a similar outlook as Carr. So he's saying these first 2 articles are very similar. Next, he says, both Carr and Anderson have respectable points on the matter. However, they also give evidence of the positives technology has on society. So he's saying these authors have generally covered the negative, but they also do discuss the positive, which is important. He's going more in depth with what they're saying, and again looking at both sides, and that's important here because he's arguing for the positive. So to say that these people who emphasize the negative also discuss the positive, that only helps his own argument. But again, he's talking about more than one author. He's showing how these authors are not doing the same exact thing. They're doing something similar. One's talking about search engines, one's talking about video games, but they're making the same general argument about technology. Finally, he says, Walter Isaacson counters both the previous articles I mentioned with his own review of an article called Smarter Than You Think. So when I taught this class before, we didn't have a textbook that had Smarter Than You Think, so the students read a review of it by someone else named Isaacson. That accounts for the difference here. But he's basically saying, I've shown you these two examples of articles that have a negative view of technology's influence. This author makes a positive one. So here he's actually talking about all three articles in one sentence at the start of another paragraph. It's going to make more sense if you read the whole student example, because you can read the paper all the way through. These sentences I just went through were the start of each paragraph in the synthesis section. So hopefully seeing those moves the student made in those sentences, this article has a negative view, which is different from my own. This other article also has a negative view. These two articles, even though they have a negative view, they do discuss some positives. Finally, this author discusses the positives. Hopefully that's a good overview of what you can do in a synthesis section and the moves you can make. I'm going to spend this last part of the lecture talking about the most important part of the synthesis section. And this is where you make the transition from the synthesis section to the argument section. So, here we go. This is the beginning of the student's argument section. A statement like this could come at the end of the synthesis section or the start of the argument section. And here he says, overall, I believe that Carr and Anderson have great points, and there are negative effects that technology has on our society. However, I agree more with Isaacson's stance. There are so many more positives than negatives that technology provides for us. The biggest one, in my eyes, as I stated before, would have to be the spread of knowledge. So this section does a number of things well. It provides a synthesis statement. There are so many more positives than negatives that technology provides for us. This is a summary of the whole synthesis section. So after you write the synthesis section, you may have a few paragraphs there. You want to give an overview. You want that succinct statement that ties everything together. Just a couple of sentences that connect all three articles. Because you want to end, you'll have covered a lot in that synthesis section, you want to end it on a cohesive note. So that student does it with a statement here. However, he does some other things as well. He adds his own unique argument. The biggest one in my eyes, as I stated before, would have to be the spread of knowledge. So, summary of the synthesis section. There are some negatives from technology, but the positives outweigh them. Okay, that's what other people have said. That's what these three other authors have said. Now, engage with that. The biggest one in my eyes, so he's showing how his argument enters that conversation by saying, the biggest positive is the spread of knowledge. So he enters into that conversation by saying the biggest positive is, and then he adds something unique by saying that positive is the spread of knowledge. So enters the conversation, but adds something unique to it. And this is how you want to end the synthesis section, or start the argument section. But right in that part of the paper, you want to give a synthesis statement that synthesizes everything. 1 to 2 sentences that kind of recap all the connections, or not all the connections, but that succinctly puts what all the articles have in common. And then you want to restate your thesis by specifically entering the conversation and adding to it. Entering it and adding to it, like this student does here. So, hopefully that all makes sense. I'm going to end by just kind of recapping the structure you can have to the first part of the paper. An intro with a thesis at the end of it, a synthesis section. Near the end of the synthesis section, provide a succinct statement, and that means just short statement, or a synthesis statement that succinctly connects all three articles to each other. So you spend a couple paragraphs explaining the connections, but then, kind of like the conclusion to a paper, a shorter version of that real briefly states what they all have in common. So an intro, a synthesis section that ends with a synthesis statement, and a transition to the argument. So another sentence or two that connect your argument to the synthesis and add something unique to it. So intro with thesis, synthesis section, brief synthesis statement, enter the conversation, add to the conversation. That'd be a more succinct way to put it. I wish I'd put it exactly that way on the slide, but hopefully you get the idea. You still have to write the whole argument section where you prove your argument. So this would really be like half the paper. But again, I think it's the half with which you're less familiar probably. You've probably written argumentative papers before. And what I'm really trying to do here is to show you how to incorporate some necessary elements that you'll need to incorporate into your writing in college to write effective argumentative papers. And so we're getting some practice with that by having you write a paper like this on these technology pieces. And so in the next lecture, I'll talk some about the argument section, and we'll look at some examples from it from the student paper. But hopefully this background on the section you're less familiar with will be enough to go on for the rough draft. And so that's my goal here. Hopefully this lecture sets you up well for the rough draft. I'll just add a couple quick notes. You'll turn the rough draft in on Sunday. Monday at like around 11, I think, is the time on Canvas. You'll get assigned to peer review partners. You'll be assigned to review. Canvas will randomly assign you to review 3 other people's papers. This is an important part of the writing process where we give each other feedback. Writing we get in our own heads. It's hard to write for readers, so we need other people to read our work. The most obvious way to do that is to have people from the class review your writing and for you to review theirs. So make sure you turn your rough draft in on time. If you turn it in after 11 on Monday, you won't get assigned partners, and I'll have to manually assign partners. So be sure to get it in before then. And then the instructions on Canvas are very clear. Actually, on the next lecture, which I should have up tomorrow if you want to watch it earlier, I'm going to go through the steps for the peer review, but it's very easy. You just click on the person's name, you can read their paper, and comment on it, and I have a handout on Canvas linked there that'll give you some instructions on how to make comments, but it's very straightforward. And I'll have info on the next lecture. And those peer reviews are due Friday, a week from this Friday. So you'll have rough draft due Sunday, peer reviews due Friday, final draft due the next Sunday. And you can also go to the Writer Center and have the Writer Center review your paper. And I think that's a great idea. The review of peers is helpful, but our Writing Center is entirely staffed by professionals, and they'll also give you some feedback on your paper. And I actually encourage that so much I'll give you 1% extra credit for doing that. It should say that on the assignment page. And there also should be an announcement coming out in Canvas that talks about the Writer Center, how to make an appointment, and reminds you of that extra credit. So I really look forward to reading your papers in a couple weeks after you do the final draft. I don't have time to review all the rough drafts myself. That's why we have the Writer Center and peer review. If you'd like any feedback on your rough draft from me, just email me. I also have that announcement on Canvas. But I'm really excited about this assignment. I'm really looking forward to reading your papers in a couple weeks, and I wish you well. I hope you do great on the rough draft. Email me if you have any questions, but hopefully this PowerPoint was helpful. Couple of notes I forgot about. Sorry. If you're having trouble coming up with your own unique argument, think about those 3 ways to respond from They Say, I Say, Chapter 4, which is what we read last week. This is good. I'm glad I included this in here. So if you can write the synthesis section and come up with that synthesis statement, come up with that statement that in just a couple of sentences encapsulates all 3 articles, you can then pick one of these ways to respond to that statement. So you're not responding to one article necessarily, you're responding to all three. How do you do that? You write a synthesis statement, and then you just respond to the synthesis. So you can disagree and explain why, agree but with a difference, or agree and disagree simultaneously. So hopefully that kind of helps you figure out your thesis. And again, you can use those templates, and I say to help with that. Oh, and this is what I said earlier. You may not know your unique argument until you write at least one draft. So write multiple drafts before turning your rough draft into Canvas, and make the conclusion to your first draft the intro to your second draft. It sounds weird, but trust me, you're going to figure out what you really want to say as you write. But think about your reader. You don't want it to take your reader that long to figure out what you mean. So use this strategy as you revise. Thank you and have a great week.